The envelope was sitting on my kitchen table when I got home from the hospital. A plain white envelope, the kind you'd get from a bank or a county clerk's office, with my name typed across the front in that cold, official font that never means anything good. My hands were still shaking when I picked it up, not from the cold, though it had been 22 degrees when Tyler drove away and left me standing on Route 28 in the dark. My hands were shaking because I had just spent 3 days in a hospital bed thinking about every choice I ever made as a father, and I had come home to find out that while I was lying there hooked up to an IV, my own son had been making choices of his own. I want you to think about that for a second. I want you to really sit with it. Your child, the person you carried home from the hospital in a car seat you spent 45 minutes trying to install correctly, the person you taught to ride a bike in the driveway on a Saturday morning, the person you stayed up worrying about every single night for the better part of 3 decades, that person drives away and leaves you in the snow on Christmas Eve. And then, while you're recovering from hypothermia in a hospital room that smells like antiseptic and old cafeteria food, he files paperwork with the county clerk's office. 3 questions were burning in my mind when I finally sat down at that kitchen table with a cup of coffee that had gone cold. First, what exactly had Tyler been doing while I was fighting to keep my core temperature above 95 degrees? Second, what had I done wrong, or what had I done right, that led to that moment on the side of that dark mountain road? And third, when he called me crying 3 days later, what was it that finally broke through all of that pride and selfishness and entitlement? The answers changed everything I thought I knew about my family, my marriage, and the kind of man my son had become. And if you stay with me through this story, I think they might change a few things for you too. If you're enjoying this story, hit that subscribe button, drop a like, and tell me where you're watching from. Just a reminder, this is a fictional dramatization for entertainment only. It's not professional legal, medical, or financial advice. Viewer discretion is advised. Enjoy the rest of the video. My name is Thomas Breck, and I have lived in the Catskill Mountains my entire life. Not the tourist parts, not the little towns with the craft breweries and the bed and breakfasts that charge $400 a night in the fall when the leaves turn. I mean the real Catskills, the ones where winter comes in hard around Thanksgiving and doesn't let go until March, where the snowplows don't always make it up the county roads before 8 in the morning, where your neighbors are a quarter-mile away and you know them by the sound of their truck engines. I grew up in a house on a back road outside Woodstock, the son of a man who did roofing and tree work, and I followed him into the trades the way sons do when the money's tight and the options feel narrow. I met Carol in 1986 at a church social in Saugerties. She was wearing a blue dress with white flowers on it, and she was laughing at something her friend had said, and I thought she was the most alive person I had ever seen in my life. We were married 2 years later in that same church, and we moved into a rental on the edge of town while I built up the landscaping business I'd been running out of my truck. The business eventually became something real, not something that made us rich, but something that kept the lights on and put food on the table and allowed us to buy the house on Spruceton Road that we still own to this day. Tyler was born in 1991, the year the business finally turned its first real profit. Then came our daughter Melissa, 3 years later in 1994, and that right there, the gap between Tyler and Melissa and the different worlds they were born into, that's where this story really starts, even though it would be another 30 years before I fully understood it. When Tyler was born, we were still scraping. Carol was working the front desk at a dentist's office. I was working 6 days a week, and we celebrated Tyler's first birthday with a cake. Carol baked herself from a mix, and candles she'd saved from the drawer under the sink. He wore hand-me-down clothes from Carol's sister's boys until he started kindergarten. We did the best we could, and I don't think he suffered for it in any real way, but there were things we couldn't give him. New baseball cleats when all the other kids had them. The class trip to Washington, D.C. in 6th grade that we quietly told him wasn't in the budget that year. A car when he turned 16, when most of his friends got at least something used and reliable to drive to school. By the time Melissa arrived in 1994, the business had grown. I had 2 crews working, I'd landed a contract with the county parks department, and we were doing okay. Not wealthy, I want to be clear about that, but okay in the way that felt like a different country from where we'd been when Tyler was small. Melissa got the newer things. Not everything, not expensive things, but newer. She had a bedroom that got repainted when she asked, where Tyler's room stayed the same faded yellow for 20 years. She had dance classes and a decent used car when she turned 17. When she got into SUNY New Paltz, We had enough saved to cover most of her first year without her taking the full loan load. Tyler went to the community college in Kingston, worked part-time at the hardware store, and paid his own way. And he did it, and I was proud of him for doing it. But I can see now, sitting at this table with the cold coffee and the envelope in front of me, I can see it clearly in a way I couldn't when I was living inside it, that he didn't experience it the same way I intended it. He didn't feel my pride. He felt the difference. He watched what Melissa got and he measured it against what he'd gotten, and somewhere in the back of his mind, in the part that keeps score even when you tell it not to, he built up a ledger. Carol knew. She told me once, when Tyler was maybe 22 and Melissa was 19, and things between the kids had gotten a little stiff at the dinner table, she said to me in the kitchen late at night, "Tom, he notices the things we did differently. You have to talk to him." I didn't. I told myself it wasn't that different, that he was a grown man now, that he'd be fine. I poured myself a glass of water, and I went to bed. I want you to hold on to that moment, because it matters more than I knew then. Around the same time, I started to notice something else. There was an old letter in the fireplace box in the living room, a box Carol kept for papers and photographs, and things she called important keepsakes. Most of the family didn't know it existed. I'd only found it myself while looking for the deed to the house one winter afternoon. Inside there was a letter Carol had written to herself, dated 1998, that I never opened. Just a sealed envelope addressed, "To Tom, when the time is right." I put it back in the box and I didn't think about it again. Not for a long time. I should have. That letter was still in that box on Christmas Eve, and by the time I finally read it, everything had already happened. The clock that was ticking in those years was a quiet one. Carol's health had been a concern since 2015, a diagnosis that we managed, that we thought we had managed, right up until December of 2019, when the doctors told us the management wasn't working anymore. We had 2 years, they said, maybe 3 if she responded well to the new treatment. She responded well enough to buy us 3.5, and she died in May of 2023, 6 months before the Christmas that changed everything. After Carol died, the house on Spruceton Road felt different. It wasn't just quieter. It was oriented differently, the way a room feels different when you move a piece of furniture that's been there for 30 years. The light came in the same windows at the same times, the floorboards creaked in the same spots, the refrigerator made its same low hum, but the center of gravity was gone. Carol had been the center of gravity for that house and for this family for 35 years, and without her, things that had been stable started to drift. Tyler had been living in Woodstock with his wife, Danielle, for about 4 years by then. They had met at a bar on Tinker Street, gotten engaged pretty fast, and bought a small house together the following year, with a down payment that came partly from a personal loan Tyler had taken out and partly from the small inheritance he'd gotten from Carol's mother when she passed. Danielle was smart and organized, and she had opinions about things which I respected, even when those opinions seemed to be nudging Tyler toward decisions I didn't fully understand. Melissa was living down in Kingston, working as a nurse, recently divorced, raising her daughter Ava on her own, with a combination of grace and exhaustion that I recognized from watching Carol do similar things when the kids were small. Melissa called me every Sunday. Tyler called maybe twice a month, and the calls had a quality to them. I don't know how to describe this exactly. A quality like someone checking something off a list. In the months after Carol's funeral, Tyler came to the house about 3 times. Each time, he walked through the rooms with a particular kind of attention that I mistook at the time for grief. He would pause in the kitchen, look at the cabinets, look at the countertops. He'd stand in the doorway to the back bedroom. He'd look at the fireplace and the box on the mantel above it. I thought he was remembering his mother. I understand now that he was thinking about the house. The house on Spruceton Road is on about 4 acres of land in the Catskills. Property values in that area have done what property values everywhere in rural upstate New York did after 2020. They went up in a way that shocked people who'd been watching land prices flatline for 20 years. My neighbor Earl Dotrich, who had a similar property 2 roads over, sold his place in the summer of 2023 for $460,000. He called me about it, and his voice had the stunned quality of a man who had just been told something he didn't entirely believe. My property, 4 acres, a 3-bedroom house that was older but solid, a barn in decent shape, and a view of the ridge that people from the city would pay a premium for, was worth somewhere in that neighborhood. Carol and I had taken out a home equity line of credit in 2017 to help with her medical expenses. But the balance on that was modest compared to what the property was worth. I owned most of it free and clear. I was 58 years old in the fall of 2023. Not in terrible health, but not in great health either. I had a bad knee from years of physical work, a back that talked to me on cold mornings, and a cardiologist who had been suggesting for 2 years that I take the beta blockers more seriously. I had no plans to sell the house. I had no plans to go anywhere. This was the house I had built my life in. This was where Carol had died, and that sounds like a morbid reason to stay. But for anyone who has ever lost someone at home surrounded by the people who love them, it isn't morbid at all. It's sacred. I told Tyler all of this when he came to me in October of 2023, 6 months after the funeral, 2 months before Christmas, and suggested that I consider selling the property and using the proceeds to move into a retirement community. He presented it like he'd done research, which he had. He had a brochure from a place in Kingston, another from a place near Catskill. He talked about maintenance costs and isolation and what he called the reality of aging alone in a rural property. I sat across from him at the kitchen table and I listened to all of it. I could smell the coffee Carol used to make. I'd been using the same beans she bought, out of habit or stubbornness, I'm not entirely sure. And I listened to my son tell me that my home was a liability. When he finished, I said, "Tyler, I'm not selling this house." He said, "Dad, you need to at least think about it." I said, "I have thought about it. I've thought about it my whole life. This is my home. This is where I'm staying." He nodded, and he left before dinner, and Danielle didn't come with him that day, and I didn't think much about that at the time. What I didn't know, what I would not know until that envelope arrived on the kitchen table after 3 days in the hospital, was that Tyler had already been talking to a real estate attorney. He had not been taking no for an answer. He had just been looking for a different approach. The disagreement about the house might have stayed a disagreement about the house if it hadn't converged with everything else that was happening that November and December. Tyler called me 3 times to revisit the conversation. Each time I said no. Each time he pushed a little harder. The 3rd time, he said something that opened up the old wound that had never fully closed between us. He said, "Dad, let's be honest. You've always been more concerned about what happens to Melissa than about what happens to me. This house, this whole thing, it's just more of the same." I didn't know what to say to that. I wanted to defend myself, and I wanted to agree with him, and those 2 impulses collided, and I said something inadequate. I said, "That's not fair, Tyler." And he said, "It never was it?" And he hung up, and I stood in the kitchen with the phone in my hand and felt about 10 different things at once, none of them good. What I felt most, underneath all the other things, was dismissed. Which is a strange feeling to have when you're the father and your child is the one lodging the complaint. But there it was. Because I heard what Tyler was actually saying. I heard the 30 years of scorekeeping in it. I heard the hand-me-down cleats and the missed class trip and the community college while his sister got the better deal. And instead of sitting down with it and really examining it, I felt like it was an accusation I needed to fight off. I was the one who had worked those 6-day weeks. I was the one who had built the business, so there was something to inherit. I was the one who had stayed. I called Melissa that night, more to process than anything else, and she said something that I have turned over in my mind many times since. She said, "Dad, Tyler has always felt like the first draft of us, like you and Mom were figuring it out on him." She wasn't being cruel. She was being honest in the way that Melissa is honest, the way that nurses learn to be honest directly, and without a lot of softening. And I sat with that for a long time after we hung up. The community in Woodstock is small enough that I heard from Earl Dortrick in November that Tyler had been talking to a real estate agent, not one I knew, someone from a bigger agency down in Kingston, and that the conversation had been about the Spruceton Road property. Earl had run into Tyler at the gas station, and Tyler had apparently said something about looking at options for Dad's place. Earl told me because he thought I already knew. He looked uncomfortable when I told him I didn't. He rubbed the back of his neck and said, "Well, hell, Tom, I thought you were in on it." That was the moment the ground shifted under me. That was when I understood that Tyler wasn't just trying to persuade me. He was trying to go around me. I drove home that afternoon through the early dark of a late November afternoon, the mountains pressing in on both sides of Route 28, the bare trees looking like the pencil sketches in a book. My phone buzzed on the seat beside me, a text from Tyler. "Can we talk this weekend? Danielle and I want to come up." I didn't respond right away. I drove home and I sat in the driveway for a few minutes with the engine off, watching a light snow begin to fall on the ridge across the valley. I thought about Carol. I thought about that sealed letter in the fireplace box. I thought about the fact that my son had, at some point, that I could not precisely identify, stopped being someone who disagreed with me and started being someone who was moving against me. The meeting with Tyler and Danielle that weekend was the kind of conversation where you understand about 20 minutes in that the conversation you are having is not actually the conversation that is being had. We sat in the living room, me in my usual chair, Tyler and Danielle on the couch, cups of coffee on the table that nobody was drinking, and Tyler laid out what he called a plan. The plan involved me selling the property, splitting the proceeds between paying off the home equity line and establishing what Tyler called a family trust, and moving to one of the retirement communities he'd identified. He had documents, printed pages in a manila folder, numbers. Danielle said very little, but she handed Tyler papers when he needed them, and she watched me with the kind of careful, measuring look that told me she had been in on the drafting of this plan for a while. I looked at the two of them, and I thought about Carol, who had sat on that same couch through every hard conversation this family had ever had, and I felt her absence with a physical weight, and I felt something else. I felt afraid. Not of Tyler exactly, but of what I was looking at. A son who loved me, I still believed that, but a son who had decided that his assessment of what was good for me superseded my own. And a daughter-in-law behind him who I was not entirely sure had my interests at heart, and no one in that room who was purely, unconditionally on my side. I told them I needed time to look at the documents. Tyler said, "Dad, we're not going to have unlimited time on this. The market won't stay like this forever, and frankly, your health won't either." That last sentence landed in the room like something dropped from a height. Danielle looked at her hands. Tyler didn't take it back. I said, "I think we're done for today," and they left. And I sat in the living room until it got dark, and I did not turn the lights on. After Tyler and Danielle left that Saturday, I did something I hadn't done in months. I called my old friend Warren Hicks, who had been running a small law practice in Saugerties for 30 years, and who had handled our wills and the deed transfer on the house back in 2002. Warren and I had been friends since before either of us had children, the kind of friends who go years without talking, and then pick up exactly where they left off. I hadn't called him since Carol's funeral. He answered on the second ring, and before I'd gotten through the first two sentences of what I was trying to tell him, he said, "Come in on Monday, Tom. Come in and bring whatever they gave you." His voice had that settled quality that lawyers and doctors develop after years of sitting across from frightened people, and just hearing it made the tightness in my chest loosen a little. I drove into Saugerties on Monday morning through a light fog that was burning off the river, and I sat in Warren's office, which smelled of old books and the particular kind of wood-heated warmth that old buildings in the Catskills have in winter, and I laid out the manila folder on his desk. He read through it carefully, the way lawyers read, without expression, without commentary, just working through the pages one at a time. When he finished, he set them down and looked at me over his glasses and said, "Tom, this is not legally enforceable as presented, but it's not nothing either. The question is, what he's planning to do if you keep saying no." I told him about the conversation with Earl, about the real estate agent in Kingston. Warren nodded slowly. He said, "There are a few different routes he could try to take. None of them easy, none of them cheap, but possible if he decides to push." He paused, and then he said something that landed hard. He said, "The other thing you need to be thinking about is your estate plan, your will, the house, everything. Because right now, based on what Carol's will left, and based on how the property is titled, if something happened to you tomorrow, Tyler would be in a position to move very quickly." He tapped the file folder. "This looks to me like a man who has been thinking about timelines." I drove home with my head full of fog that had nothing to do with the weather. I made myself a sandwich I didn't eat. I sat at the kitchen table and I thought about the letter in the fireplace box, and I almost got up to get it, and then something stopped me. Hesitation is the word for it, a reluctance to know things which is its own form of fear. The letter had been there for 25 years. It could wait a little longer. That decision, that small, frightened hesitation, was the one thing I most wish I could go back and change. 2 weeks before Christmas, I drove up to the hardware store in Phoenicia to pick up some weather stripping for the back door. On my way back to the truck, I ran into Linda Phelps, who had been Carol's closest friend since high school, and who had been checking on me periodically since the funeral with the faithful regularity of someone who takes her responsibilities seriously. Linda asked me how I was doing, and I gave her the standard answer, and then she got a look on her face that told me she was deciding whether to say something. She said it. She said, "Tom, I don't want to get in the middle of anything, but I had coffee with Danielle last week and I walked away feeling like I should tell you to be careful. I asked her what she meant. She said she was asking me a lot of questions about Carol, about Carol's things, about whether Carol had any paperwork or documents that she kept privately. Linda looked me in the eye. She mentioned the fireplace box. I drove home with the weather stripping in the back seat and the cold air coming through the window because I needed to feel it on my face. Someone had told Danielle about that box. Someone who knew this house well enough to know where Carol kept things, and the only person who fit that description, besides me, was Tyler. Christmas Eve came the way it always comes in the Catskills. Suddenly, after weeks of grey waiting, the sky cleared and everything turned white and still, and the cold settled in like it was going to live there. I had spent the morning doing the small Christmas things that Carol had always done, and that I had been trying to carry on, because not doing them felt like losing her again. I put the wreath on the door. I put the candles in the windows. I made her recipe for the molasses cookies that I can never quite get as good as hers, but that Ava, Melissa's daughter, has always loved. Melissa and Ava were coming for Christmas dinner the next day. That was the plan. Tyler and Danielle were coming on Christmas Eve, just for the evening, just for dinner, Tyler had said on the phone, and his voice had that careful quality it had been carrying for weeks, the voice of someone managing a situation. I made a roast. I set the table the way Carol had always set it for Christmas, with the good cloth and the old candle holders that had been a wedding gift from Carol's aunt. I put on the record of Christmas music that we had always played. I was doing all of it, with the particular focus of someone who is trying very hard not to feel a thing. Tyler and Danielle arrived at 6. The dinner was fine in the way that dinners are fine when everyone at the table is performing normality over a substrate of things unsaid. Danielle was pleasant and a little remote. Tyler ate well and talked about work and didn't bring up the house. I was almost starting to believe that we had reached some kind of tacit truce when Tyler got up from the table to help me with the dishes, something he hadn't done in years, and while we were standing at the sink with the water running, he said, "Dad, I need you to sign something before we leave." I turned off the faucet. I turned to look at him. He was already reaching into the inside pocket of his jacket. He pulled out a folded sheet of paper, not the same kind of official document as before, something different, something that had the look of something downloaded and printed at home, and he set it on the counter next to the sink. He said, "It's just an authorization, just giving me the authority to speak on your behalf to the real estate agent. Nothing binding, just so we can get a clearer picture of the market." I looked at the document. I looked at my son. I said, "Tyler, I have told you 3 times that I am not selling this house. I am telling you again." He said, "Dad, you're being unreasonable and you're going to regret it." I said, "That is my right. I am 58 years old and this is my house." He said, "And this is the thing I will hear in my memory for the rest of my life." He said, "You are being stubborn and difficult, and I don't know what else I can do for you." I said very quietly, "You can start by understanding that this was your mother's home too, and I am not going to sign a piece of paper on Christmas Eve that would have broken her heart." The silence that followed lasted about 4 seconds. Then Danielle came into the kitchen and said it was getting late and they had a long drive. Tyler folded the paper back up and put it in his pocket. He said, "I think it's better if we don't stay tonight. I'll call after the holiday." He didn't look at me when he said it. He and Danielle put on their coats and I walked them to the door because that is what you do. That is the thing that keeps you human, even when everything else is dissolving around you. I was going to let them go. I was going to watch the taillights of his truck disappear down Spruceton Road and go back inside and sit by the fire and call Melissa and tell her what had happened. But Tyler stopped at his truck and turned back, and there was something in his face and frustration, I think, and underneath the frustration something that looked like fear, though I couldn't identify it as that yet. And he said, "Dad, just come out to the truck for a second. I want to show you something on my phone, the listing. Just look at the number." I don't know why I went. I have asked myself that question many times in the months since, and I think the answer is the same answer it always is when you do something that turns out to be a mistake. I still believed it was possible to reach him. I still thought that if I could just find the right words, the right moment, something would unlock between us and my son would come back to me from wherever he had gone. I walked out to the truck without my coat. It was 22 degrees and there was no wind, which is the kind of cold that doesn't feel like an emergency until it does. Tyler showed me something on his phone. I barely looked at it, to be honest. I was watching his face. And then he said, "Just think about it, Dad, that's all I'm asking." And before I could answer, Danielle said something from the passenger seat that I couldn't quite hear. And Tyler said, "I gotta go." And he got in the truck and back down the driveway. I stood there and watched the truck reach the end of the drive and turn right onto Route 28, heading back toward Woodstock. I stood there for another few seconds, thinking that he would stop, that he would see me in the rearview mirror and stop. The taillights disappeared around the bend. I was standing on the shoulder of Route 28 in 22-degree weather without a coat, and the nearest house was a quarter-mile away, and the Christmas lights in its windows were the only light I could see. My phone was inside, my keys were inside. The door had a spring latch that I had been meaning to fix for years, and it had locked behind me. I want to be honest about the next 4 hours, because it would be easy to dramatize them in a way that isn't accurate, and the accuracy matters. I was in danger. I knew I was in danger. I am a man who has spent his life in these mountains, and I know what cold does to a body, especially a body that has already had a cardiologist waving red flags. What I felt in those first minutes wasn't panic. Panic would have been cleaner. What I felt was a kind of stunned, grinding disbelief, the way you feel when something happens that you intellectually know is happening, but that your brain keeps presenting to you as too absurd to be real. I walked to the end of my driveway and looked both ways on Route 28, the way you do when you're looking for cars, but also, I suppose, looking for any evidence that someone is out there and aware that you exist. Nothing. The road was empty in both directions, the asphalt dark and dry in the cold. My feet in their dinner shoes, not boots, dinner shoes, thin-soled leather shoes I had put on because it was Christmas Eve and I had been trying to treat it like a real holiday, were already telling me that I had maybe 40 minutes before the cold became something more serious than discomfort. I walked down the road toward the nearest neighbor's lights, and I want to tell you that this was a dignified walk, but it wasn't. It was the walk of a man who is trying to move quickly without running, because running might mean admitting to himself how scared he is. I made it to Earl Doutrick's place. His lights were on, and his truck was in the driveway, and I knocked on the door and his wife Bev answered, and the look on her face when she saw me told me something about how I must have appeared. She said, "Tom, my God, get inside." I was inside for maybe 20 minutes, enough for some warmth and for Bev to press a mug of hot coffee into my hands, and for Earl to say, "Do you want me to call someone?" and for me to say, "I'm okay," and then I wasn't okay. The cold had gotten further in than I'd realized, the way cold does when you're running on adrenaline and not noticing what your body is telling you, and I stood up from the kitchen chair and I felt the room tilt, and Earl Doutrick, who is 63 years old and not a small man, caught me before I went down. The ambulance came in 11 minutes, which is a good response time for a rural road in the Catskills on Christmas Eve. I don't remember much of the ride. I remember the lights inside the ambulance and the particular quality of the EMT's voice, which had that same settled competence as Warren's voice, the voice of someone who deals with frightened people for a living. I remember thinking about Carol. I remember thinking that if I died tonight, Tyler would have the property in a month and Carol's Christmas china would end up in an estate sale. I remember feeling more angry than afraid. And I remember, as the ambulance was turning onto Route 28, that I had not read the letter. I spent 3 days in the hospital, hypothermia, mild but serious enough, and one episode of atrial fibrillation that the cardiologist said was likely triggered by the cold and the stress together. They kept me for observation. My phone had been retrieved from the house. Bev Doutrick had a spare key that Carol had given her years ago, which is the kind of practical provision that women who live in the country tend to make for one another, and I had it with me. I called Melissa from the hospital on Christmas morning. She arrived by noon on Christmas Day, Ava in the back seat, and she sat next to my bed and held my hand and didn't say anything dramatic, just sat there, which was exactly right. She had called Tyler. Tyler knew where I was. He did not come. He did not come on Christmas Day. He did not come on the 26th. He called on the 27th, a call I did not take because I was in the middle of a conversation with the cardiologist about medication changes, and he left a voicemail that Melissa listened to before she let me hear it. She looked at me with a careful expression after she listened and said, "Dad, he sounds upset." I listened to it. Tyler's voice on that voicemail was different from the voice at the kitchen sink on Christmas Eve. The management was gone from it. He sounded like someone standing on the edge of something. He said, "Dad, I need to talk to you. I found out some things. Call me." His voice cracked on the last 2 words. I put the phone down on the hospital blanket and looked at the ceiling for a long time. I was discharged on the 28th. Melissa drove me home. The house was cold in the particular way that a heated house gets when it's been without people for a few days. A deeper cold than the outside, a cold that's been accumulating. And the envelope was on the kitchen table. Melissa had found it on the floor near the door. It had been slid through the mail slot. When she came to get some clothes for me after I was admitted, she'd put it on the table. The return address was a law firm in Kingston. She watched me open it from across the table, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea, her face doing the thing that medical professionals' faces do when they're waiting to respond to information. The letter was from an attorney named Garrett Finn, and it was a formal notification that Tyler, as concerned adult child, was initiating a process to explore conservatorship options with respect to my property and finances, citing my age and what the letter described as declining health and demonstrated inability to maintain safe living conditions. The letter was dated December 23rd. Tyler had called this attorney the day before Christmas Eve, the day before he came to my house for Christmas dinner. I read it twice. Then I set it down on the table very carefully, as if it might break. My hands were not shaking this time. My hands were extremely still. Melissa said, "Dad." I said, "I know." She said, "He filed this before he even came to dinner." I said, "I know." Conservatorship. The word sat in the middle of the kitchen. For anyone who doesn't know what that word means in a legal context, it means that someone is asking a court to declare you incapable of making your own decisions and to appoint a guardian to manage your affairs. It can involve your money, your property, your daily life. It is a legal process designed to protect people who genuinely cannot care for themselves, people with severe dementia, people who have suffered incapacitating illness, and it is also, in some families, a weapon. I thought about what Warren Hicks had said about timelines. I thought about Danielle handing Tyler papers at the kitchen table. I thought about Tyler showing me that real estate listing in the cold, and about those taillights disappearing around the bend. And I thought, with a cold clarity that was different from the cold of Route 28, about that letter in the fireplace box. I went to the living room. I opened the box. It was still there, exactly where I'd left it 25 years ago. Hairplain white envelope, sealed, addressed in Carol's handwriting, "To Tom when the time is right." I carried it back to the kitchen table. I sat down. I looked at Melissa. She looked at me. I opened the letter. Carol had written it in 1998. Tyler was 7. Melissa was 4. The letter was 2 pages in Carol's handwriting, the particular slanted, careful script she used when she was writing something important. She started by saying that she hoped I would never need to read this letter, and that if I was reading it, she hoped she had found a better time to show it to me, and that this letter was now just something I was reading after the fact, with full knowledge of the things she was about to say. But she was writing it down because she needed to put it somewhere, and she needed me to have it, even if I never needed it. She wrote about Tyler. She wrote about the things she had seen in him as a small boy, and she wrote with the particular love and honesty of a mother who sees her child whole. She said that Tyler was bright and loving and capable of tremendous loyalty, but that he carried a wound from his earliest years that he had not been able to name. She said she believed that wound was the belief that he was valued less than he deserved, not because we told him that, but because children absorb the material facts of their circumstances with an accuracy that adults find inconvenient. She wrote, "Tyler will grow up knowing that his sister had things he did not. He will make peace with this, or he will not. I am afraid that whether he makes peace with it will depend on whether someone tells him the truth before the wound calcifies." And then she wrote the truth. She wrote that before Tyler was born, before we were married, she had inherited a small amount of money from her grandmother, $12,000, that she had never told me about it because we were young and the money had felt like hers, and she had been afraid I would want to use it for the business, that she had put it in a savings account under her own name, and that it had grown slowly over the years. That by 1998, the account held a little over $22,000, and that she had always intended to tell me about it, and to tell Tyler and Melissa about it when they were adults, because it was money that she wanted to pass on in equal shares. She wrote, "I am afraid that if I don't tell Tom now and something happens to me, Tyler will find out about this money, and he will interpret my silence as another version of being left out. It will not matter to him that the silence was unintentional. What will matter to him is the pattern." I read that last sentence 4 times. Melissa was crying before I got to the end. I was not crying. I was feeling something that took me a while to identify, and when I identified it, the word for it was guilty, not for anything I had done deliberately, but for the carelessness of the good intentions that had allowed a wound to grow in my son for 30 years while I told myself he was fine. The account. I hadn't known about the account. After Carol died, I had worked through the estate with Warren Hicks, and there had been no mention of any account in Carol's sole name, because by 1998, the date of the letter, the account had existed. But by 2023, when Carol died, what had become of it? I called Warren from the kitchen table that afternoon. I told him about the letter. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Tom, if Carol had a separate account and she didn't update her estate documents to include it explicitly, it may have become part of the general estate, or it may have transferred by beneficiary designation, or, and I hate to say this, someone with access to her accounts in her last years might have already moved it." Who had access to Carol's accounts in her last years? Melissa had medical power of attorney, but Tyler had financial power of attorney, granted in 2021, when Carol's condition had made certain financial management tasks difficult for her. Tyler had been the one managing her accounts. I called Warren Hicks on the morning of December 29th and asked him to come to the house. He drove up from Saugerties in the late morning, parked his old Volvo in the driveway, and came in with his briefcase and his reading glasses and a thermos of coffee that I suspected was more bourbon than coffee. He sat at the kitchen table, and he read Carol's letter, and he read the letter from Garrett Finn, and he looked at both of them together for a long time without saying anything. Then he said, "Tom, you need to know the whole picture before we do anything. Because if what I'm thinking happened with that account actually happened, this situation is different from what it looks like on the surface. This isn't just Tyler trying to manage your property. This might be a situation where Tyler was trying to get ahead of a problem," he paused, "or cover one up." We spent the next week building the picture. Warren subpoenaed Carol's bank records. He had the standing to do it as the executor of her estate, something Tyler apparently had not accounted for in his planning. What those records showed was something that Warren described to me in his measured lawyer way as irregular. In 2021, around the same time Tyler received financial power of attorney, Carol's savings account, the account that, based on the letter, had likely grown to somewhere between $35,000 and $40,000 over 23 years, had been depleted, not all at once, over several months in a series of transfers to a joint account in Tyler and Carol's names that Tyler had opened, apparently with Carol's consent, as a convenience for managing her care expenses. The transfers totaled $38,000. Carol's documented medical expenses for 2021 were about $9,000. The remaining $29,000 was, as Warren put it, not obviously accounted for by the stated purpose. Tyler had not stolen the money in the bold, obvious sense. He had done what many people in similar situations do, which is use an authority he'd been given in good faith and which exists in a legal grey area, especially when the person who granted that authority is no longer alive to testify about her intentions. There might be explanations, there might be documentation I didn't have, but Warren did not look like a man who expected innocent explanations to emerge. I want to be fair here, and I want to be accurate because this story is about more than anger and more than justice. Tyler had been managing Carol's care at a time when she was very ill and when the responsibilities were real and heavy. He had been doing things for her that I know cost him time and emotional reserves that he did not necessarily have to spare. I do not know, and I will probably never know with certainty, whether he moved that money with full awareness of what he was taking from his mother, or whether he told himself a story that made it reasonable. What I know is that he moved it. And what I know is that when he came to me on Christmas Eve and pushed me to sign papers, and when he filed the conservatorship inquiry the day before he came to dinner, he was operating with the knowledge that those bank records existed and that I might eventually have access to them. The conservatorship filing was, Warren explained, something that could look like preemptive protection of assets if examined from a certain angle. If Tyler were declared my conservator, before I could discover and act on the financial irregularities, his control over the estate, over the house, over any legal proceedings, would have been substantially different. I don't know if he thought it through that far. I don't know if Danielle thought it through for him. What I know is that the timing was not coincidental. I asked Warren what the conservatorship filing would require to proceed. He explained that Tyler would have to demonstrate, to the satisfaction of a court, that I was incapable of managing my own affairs. The hypothermia incident would be part of his argument. The cardiologist's notes would be part of his argument. My age would be part of his argument. Warren said, "None of it is sufficient on its own, and with you standing in front of a judge looking healthy and cogent and presenting this evidence about the bank records, it is going to be a very different hearing than Tyler was likely anticipating." We had 30 days to respond to the conservatorship filing. The hearing would be in January. That was the clock we were working against, and every day between December 29th and the hearing was a day of building the case that I was a capable adult with full authority over my own affairs, and of documenting what had happened to Carol's account. Melissa was my anchor through those days. She sat at the kitchen table with me in the evenings and helped me organize the documents, the bank records, the estate papers, the letter, the printouts of Tyler's communications with the real estate agent that Warren had obtained as part of the discovery process. She was efficient and thorough, and she did not editorialize about her brother except once, when she looked up from a page of bank transfer records late at night and said very quietly, "Mum would be so ashamed." Then she turned the page and kept working. She did not say it again. My neighbor Earl Doutrich came by on New Year's Day and sat in the kitchen and drank coffee and told me he would testify on my behalf about my character and competency if it came to that. Bev came with him and she squeezed my hand and didn't say much, but that said enough. Linda Phelps, Carol's old friend, called to say the same thing. These were not dramatic declarations. They were the ordinary loyalty of neighbors and friends who have known you long enough to consider your troubles their business. And I want to tell you that in those days, that ordinary loyalty felt like the most extraordinary thing in the world. I had not spoken to Tyler since the hospital. He had called twice more and left voicemails that I had not returned. Warren said it was better to keep the communication through him for now. I agreed, though it cost me something to agree. The hearing was on the 14th of January, in the county courthouse in Catskill. It was a grey Tuesday morning, the kind of Catskill's January day where the sky and the road and the buildings are all roughly the same color, and the air smells like wood smoke and cold pavement. I wore a good jacket, not the dinner shoes, actual boots, and I arrived early with Warren and Melissa. Tyler was already in the building when we got there. He was standing in the hallway outside the hearing room with his attorney, Garrett Finn, who was younger than I expected, and had the eager, slightly pressured energy of a man who has been told by his client that this is a straightforward case. Tyler saw me across the hallway and something moved in his face. Not guilt, exactly, or not only guilt, something more complicated. He looked like a person who has been running towards something for a long time and has just arrived close enough to see it clearly for the first time. Danielle was not there. I found out later, through the particular informal network of small community information that is more reliable than any official channel, that Danielle had left 3 days before the hearing. She had taken a bag and moved to her sister's apartment in Newburgh. Whether she left because of the bank records, which Tyler must have known Warren had obtained by that point, or because of something else that had broken between them, I don't know. What I know is that Tyler stood in that hallway without her, and he looked like a man who had arrived at a position he had not fully imagined actually occupying. The hearing was not dramatic in the way that courtroom scenes are dramatic in movies. There was no gavel, no gallery, no moment of revelation met with gasps. It was a small room with a judge who had the manner of someone who has heard a great many things and is rarely surprised, a court recorder, the 2 attorneys, me, Tyler, and Melissa, who sat in the gallery row and kept her hands folded in her lap. Warren presented the conservatorship filing and then, methodically and without theatrics, began to dismantle it. He had statements from my cardiologist explaining that my health was being managed appropriately and that there was no medical basis for a finding of incapacity. He had statements from Earl Doutrich and 2 other neighbors speaking to my clear-mindedness and competence. He had my business records showing that I had managed the landscaping company, currently being run by my longtime foreman, though I remained a partner, without issue. He presented all of this calmly, and the judge received it calmly. Then Warren set Carol's letter on the table. He set the bank records beside it. He set the records of the transfers beside those. He let the documents do their own work. He simply said, "Your Honor, I want to ensure the court has full context regarding the circumstances of this filing. The petitioner has financial authority concerns of his own that appear to be relevant background." The judge looked at the documents. The judge looked at Tyler. Tyler's attorney said something in Tyler's ear. Tyler stared at the table. The hearing was adjourned. The conservatorship petition was denied pending further review. Within 48 hours of the hearing, Garrett Finn had withdrawn from the case. Within a week, Tyler's attorneys had contacted Warren to indicate that Tyler was prepared to cooperate fully with a review of Carol's estate finances. That phrase, "one cooperate fully," had the sound of something agreed to after a long night and a conversation no one wanted to have. The conservatorship was formally dismissed on February 3rd. I have the paperwork in a folder in the kitchen drawer. I look at it sometimes, not with pride exactly, but with the particular complicated feeling of someone who has survived something by being forced to be stronger than they were comfortable being. The financial review that followed over the next 2 months was overseen by Warren and a forensic accountant he brought in, a woman from Albany named Deborah Crane, who had the air of someone who has seen every variety of family financial entanglement and holds no illusions about any of it. What she found was that $22,000 of the $38,000 that had been transferred from Carol's account was directly recoverable. Tyler had kept it in an account that hadn't been touched, which Warren told me was either a sign of guilt or a sign that some part of him had always known it didn't belong to him. The remaining $16,000 had been spent on what exactly was never fully documented, though the period corresponded with some home renovation expenses at Tyler and Danielle's house. Tyler agreed to repay the $22,000. The $16,000 became the subject of a separate negotiation that I eventually chose to resolve by not pursuing further. That decision was mine, and it was not made easily, but I will explain it. Tyler called me on the last day of January. It was a Saturday morning, light snow falling on the ridge, the kind of morning that looks like a Christmas card if you can get outside of everything that has happened to appreciate it. I was drinking coffee at the kitchen table. I had finally gotten back to the habit of making it the way I like it, rather than the way Carol liked it, which is a small thing but felt like a small step toward something. And the phone rang, and it was Tyler. I answered it. I want you to understand that I had not decided to do that. My hand made the decision before my head could weigh in. I answered it, and I said his name, and there was a silence on the other end of the line that lasted long enough that I thought the call had dropped. And then Tyler's voice came through the phone. And it was not the managed voice, not the voice of the man with the manila folder and the real estate listings. It was a younger voice. A voice I hadn't heard in a long time. He said, "Dad," and then he said, "I don't know where to start." And then he started to cry. I sat with that. I let the silence have its space. Outside the kitchen window, the snow was coming down on the road and the bare trees, and somewhere under 4 inches of snow, the frozen ground was holding everything that Carol had planted in the yard over 35 years. The bulbs she put in every fall, the perennials she tended every spring, all of it sleeping and waiting. Tyler said, "I found her letter. Not your copy. She left one for me, too. I found it in the box with her things that I had in storage. It was addressed to me." He stopped. "She wrote it in 1998, too. She wrote it the same day." He stopped again. "She told me she knew I was keeping score. She said she understood why. She said she was going to fix it." Another pause. "She said that the money she had saved was for both of us. Equal shares. She said she was going to tell me and Melissa about it when she thought we were old enough to understand. She said she was sorry it took her so long to do the right thing." I thought about Carol in 1998, sitting at the kitchen table while the kids were in bed writing 2 letters. I thought about her trying to prepare for things she could not control. I thought about how much she carried alone. Tyler said, "I found out about the money after she died. I found the account statements and He stopped for a long time. I told myself it was just equalizing things. I told myself it was owed to me. I told myself she would have wanted me to have it." His voice went thin on the last sentence. "But she didn't want me to take it. She wanted to give it to us, together, with you knowing. That's what the letter said." He was crying again. "I turned her gift into something I'm ashamed of. There are moments in life that you do not plan for, because you cannot imagine them until you are standing inside them. I was standing inside one. I had spent 6 weeks being afraid, and then being angry, and then being strategic, and then being exhausted. And I was sitting at the kitchen table on a snowy Saturday morning, hearing my son grieve his own choices. And I understood something that I had not had room to understand before. The story was not about the money. The money was what happened to the wound when it was left too long in the dark. I said, "Tyler, I need to tell you about my failures too. I need to tell you about the things your mother saw that I was too stubborn to look at." And I told him. I told him about Carol's warning in the kitchen, the one I had dismissed. I told him about the class trip and the car, and the things I'd told myself were not a big deal because I had not been paying the price for them. I told him that I had allowed a distance to grow between us, that I had labeled his fault because that was easier than looking at my own part in it. I told him that when he was standing in the living room after the funeral, looking at the rooms, I had told myself he was grieving when I knew, on some level I hadn't wanted to access, that something was wrong, and I had not reached toward him. The conversation went on for almost 2 hours. It was not a resolution. Resolutions don't happen in 2 hours, not for things built over 30 years, but it was a beginning. It was two people sitting in the rubble of what they had allowed to accumulate between them, without pretending the rubble was something else. Tyler asked if he could come to the house. I said yes. I said, come in the spring when the ground is soft enough to walk in the yard, because there are things your mother planted that I want to show you. It is April now, a wet early spring Tuesday, and the snow is mostly gone from the ridge, and there are crocuses coming up along the front walk that Carol put in back in 2009. The Spruceton Road property is not for sale. The conservatorship petition is dismissed and filed away. The financial review is essentially complete, and the settlement that Warren negotiated, Tyler repaying the $22,000 in installments and the remaining $16,000 addressed through an adjustment in how the eventual estate is structured, is a piece that cost everyone something, and that I believe Carol would consider fair if not perfect. Tyler and Danielle did not reunite. She has an apartment in Newburgh, and they are, as far as I can tell, proceeding toward a quiet dissolution. I have no particular feelings about that, except a mild, uncharitable thought that I try not to dwell on too long. Tyler is living in a rental in Woodstock while he figures out what comes next. He came to the house in March and we walked the property, and I showed him the things Carol had planted. He stood for a long time in the vegetable garden she had kept for 20 years, which is dormant now, but still holds the careful order she brought to it, and he didn't say anything. He didn't need to. Melissa brought Ava for Easter weekend, and we made Carol's recipe for the molasses cookies together, Ava standing on a step stool and getting flour on her shirt. And I thought about the things that are passed down without anyone deciding to pass them down. The recipes and the ways of holding a wooden spoon, and the specific smell of a particular combination of spices that is somehow both the smell of your kitchen and the smell of your whole life. And I thought about the things that are also passed down without anyone deciding to pass them down. The scorekeeping, the silence in the kitchen late at night, the letters written and not sent. I have made changes since January. I sat down with Warren and redid the estate plan completely. Clear, explicit, fair. Both Tyler and Melissa know exactly what's in it. There are no ambiguities for grief and resentment to fill. The house on Spruceton Road stays in the family in trust. The finances are documented. Nothing is hidden. When I called Tyler to tell him about the new estate plan, his response was a long pause and then, "Thank you, Dad." I think he meant it to carry more than its literal weight. I chose to receive it that way. I still have the sealed envelope that Tyler's attorney sent after the conservatorship was filed. I still have Carol's letter. I keep both of them in the fireplace box, not out of bitterness, but because they are part of the story of this family, and because I have learned something about what happens when you put documents away and tell yourself you'll deal with them when the time is right. The time is always now. The time is always the moment you're living in, before the cold gets all the way in. Warren told me on the phone a few weeks ago that the most common family legal crisis he sees in his career involves money that was never talked about, children who absorbed their parents' silences and turned them into injuries, and good people who waited too long to say the difficult true thing. He said, most of the families who end up in my office weren't trying to hurt each other. They just thought they had more time to figure it out. He said it in his measured lawyer way, without drama. I wrote it down on a notepad on the kitchen table, and the notepad is still there. Melissa comes every other Sunday. Tyler comes about once a month. We eat dinner, not the performance of a holiday dinner, just a meal. And we talk. And sometimes we talk around the hard things, and sometimes we go straight at them. And I think the ratio of straight at to around it is slowly improving. I am learning, at 58, to say things directly. It turns out, you can still learn that. There is a particular hour in late afternoon in the spring Catskills, when the light is coming across the ridge at a low angle, and everything is that saturated green that only happens for about 3 weeks in April and May, where the world looks exactly the way it did when Carol was alive, and for a moment that is sometimes terrible and sometimes quietly beautiful. Everything is exactly as it should have been. I sit on the porch on those evenings, and I drink my coffee and I look at the ridge and I think about the letter she wrote in 1998, and I think about how she was trying to hold things together across time, trying to protect people she loved from themselves. She didn't succeed entirely, neither did I, but here we are still talking, still sitting at the same table, still trying. That, I have decided, is enough. It has to be enough. Because the alternative, the quiet, angry, document filing, Christmas Eve in the cold alternative, is no way for anyone to live. Not Tyler, not me, not the family we are trying, imperfectly, still to be. Thanks for watching until the end. If this story touched you, please subscribe and give this video a thumbs up. As a final reminder, this was a fictional dramatization for entertainment purposes only and does not constitute legal, medical, or financial advice. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. I'll see you in the next story.